Great. I think we can begin. The numbers have definitely slowed down. I'm sure there'll be a few more people joining, but I think that we can now begin. And it's my real pleasure as President of the Royal Entomological Society to welcome you all to our 2022 Verrall Lecture, and to thank Camille for joining us and for being our lecturer this year. I know we've had some delays in getting to the 2022 Verrall Lecture, and I only wish we could all be in person, and we very much hope that in 2023 that will indeed be the case. I would, of course, really like to encourage everyone, if you're not a member or fellow of the Royal Entomological Society, it is a fantastic society to be part of, and we would really warmly welcome you in joining. And if you go and visit our new website, you see that you can do that online now, and there are a variety, a number of concessions, and I try and remember to say that students are free for the first year, so really no excuse not to join. It's a fantastic society, and we really look forward to welcoming you. So to the Verrall. So the Verrall has a very, very long history, and with the Verrall Lecture goes alongside usually the Verrall Supper. Of course, for a few years now, we haven't had that Verrall Supper, but we very much hope that we will be back to that and back together next year. But we're really delighted that this year we will have a Verrall Lecture. And it's tradition for the Verrall Lecture that we invite someone to give a talk of their globally important research. And there's no doubt about it that our speaker today will be presenting us with some globally important research, and also exceptionally topical with the IPCC reporting just this week. So we're incredibly privileged to have Camille with us for this lecture. So I'm going to give a very, very short introduction, and Camille, you'll have to fill in with some extra information as you go through. But Camille is the Director of Research at the CNRS Station for Experimental and Theoretical Ecology in France, and she holds a Make Our Planet Great Again Laureate position. Her research, as I'm sure many, many people are familiar with, focuses on the impacts of climate change on wild plants and animals, and really spans a huge breadth from work on butterflies to synthetic analysis of global impacts on a whole range of species, not only within terrestrial biomes, but also within marine biomes. She's authored numerous assessments of impacts on climate change, on agricultural pests, and also human health and changes in disease risk. And it's really notable that her 2003 paper in Nature was ranked the most highly cited paper in climate change through the Carbon Brief in 2015. It's had many, many awards and accolades, and I'm going to be really excited to hand over the President's Medal later on today on behalf of the Royal Entomological Society. But that medal will sit alongside other awards that she has, including being the second highest cited author in climate change, being named the 2013 Distinguished Scientist by the Texas Academy of Sciences. She's been elected Fellow of the European Academy of Sciences, Fellow of the Ecological Society of America, and Honorary Fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. I won't ask her to name which of those is her greatest accolades. She's received the Conservation Achievement Award by the National Wildlife Federation and was named Outstanding Woman Working on Climate Change by the IUCN. She's worked with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for more than 20 years and is an official contributor to the IPCC's Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded in 2007. She's currently a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for their 6th assessment report, which was announced and received on Monday. She also has affiliations with the University of Plymouth in the UK and the University of Texas in the US. And we're just extremely grateful that in a very, very busy week in which the IPCC has been reporting, that we have you here with us, Camille, representing for the Verrall Lecture 2022 for the Royal Entomological Society. It really is my great pleasure to hand over to you, and I very much look forward to what you have to say, and I very much look forward to our discussion afterwards. So please put your Q&A into the Q&A box, and over to you, Camille.
Thank you very much, Helen. What a lovely introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here. I spent many wonderful years living in Britain, but I was brought to France by President Macron's Make Our Planet Great Again program. That was an opportunity too good to pass up. So I am physically in France right now, but trying to get to the UK as much as possible during a pandemic. So I'm going to share my screen now. Just give me a moment. And hopefully you can all see
We can.
the full screen.
Yes, we can.
Great.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Camille.
Perfect. Well, as Helen said, I've just finished a very exhausting, more than 2-week process of the government's approving our summary for policymakers. This is a report that is 5 years in the making, took a very long time, and I'm very pleased that our key messages are in the summary for policymakers as strongly as we had hoped they would be. The government actually had a lot of good feedback, helped us make it clearer, and so we're very grateful to them as well. So the IPCC is, it's a complex process. I wanted to explain a little bit about what's behind it. This is from the launch on Monday. The woman in the corner is one of our co-chairs, Deborah Roberts, and this is only, there are 3 working groups. Working group 1 is the climate scientist. I'm in working group 2, which are the impacts people. And then in another month, you're going to have working group 3 coming out with their report, which is on, basically there's the solutions people. What do we do about it? Mitigation. But just within our working group, we had 270 authors representing 67 countries, but then triple that in contributing authors. So many, many, many people helped put this together. It's enormously more diverse than it was when I first started 20 some years ago. We now have it at more than, almost half of the authors are from developing countries. Many indigenous peoples were authors this time, which really helped improve our assessment to make it more accurate for many of these areas that were underrepresented perhaps in past reports. There are still a few more men, but when I started out, there were maybe, I think, literally 3 women out of 200 and some men. So 41% women this is a big step forward. It was a very good collegial group. And the amount of literature on climate change, both observed impacts, projected impacts, different kinds of risks, has absolutely blossomed since the last report. It is, I will be honest, it is overwhelming. So we tried to focus on large reviews, big meta-analyses, but even so, we had more than 34,000 references for the report as a whole. Just an astonishing number. For the chapter that I led, which was the chapter on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, in the Word document, the text is the same length as the references, if that gives you an idea. And we also, at each round, we had 3 different rounds of reviews. At each round, we got reviewers' comments, more than 60,000 for the report as a whole. And as authors, we had to respond to each and every one of these review comments, and those will be published in the end as well. So it's a very intensive process. People try to relate it to the peer-reviewed literature, and what I tell them is it is enormously more heavily reviewed and scrutinized than any peer-reviewed publication I've ever published. So very intensive process, and we really are trying to get it right to be able to give an assessment of the current state of science of how climate change has impacted both the natural and the human world and where we think it's going. So I want to back up a little bit to the Working Group 1 report, which was released last August, which is the physical science basis of climate change. And they concluded that global warming will continue until 2050 at least, under all the emission scenarios, including the lowest emission scenarios, and that we're fairly likely to exceed what the 1.5 and 2 degree targets that were agreed upon in the Paris Accords back in 2015. It's not totally impossible to stay under them, but you would have to have absolutely drastic deep reductions in emissions in order to stay under those targets. So in practical terms, we probably will exceed those. One of the reasons that it's becoming more and more difficult to stay below those target global warming values is that the ocean and the land, the biosphere in both the ocean and the land and the ocean water itself has been an enormous sink for the carbon emissions that humans have been putting out. I think in total, something like half of the carbon emissions have been sucked up by the oceans and the land over the past 150 years. But that sink is weakening. The ocean is becoming saturated. The plant systems that have been the best at removing and storing carbon are starting to have the processes change because of climate change. And I'll talk about that a little later on. So this is the amount of change we've already seen. This is actually only relating to 1 degree centigrade warming, and we've had 1.09 centigrade warming. But the big take-home messages from this map is that warming has happened everywhere, except for maybe a small spot of one ocean has had a little bit of cooling, and that the warming is greater at the higher northern latitudes. And a lot of that is driven by a change in albedo. As you get less sea ice, the blue ocean actually absorbs a lot more heat, whereas the ice reflects it. And so that higher warming towards the Arctic was expected many, many years ago. And indeed, we're seeing that happen. So what has it been doing? And because this is a talk for the Royal Entomological Society, I am going to focus on the impacts that climate change has had on insects around the world. Some of these are insects we would rather not be seeing doing well, like the insects that carry diseases both of animals and of humans, mosquitoes, sandflies, ticks. So what I'm showing you now is actually going back to projections from 2014 on where a particular mosquito, Aedes aegypti, might be shifting. So the top one was its current distribution back in 2014. All the red areas are where aegypti was. And the bottom map is where it was projected to change with climate change. So those green areas, and I do apologize for the coloring, I didn't do it. Those those of you who have red-green color deficiency, I do apologize. These green areas are areas where this particular mosquito was expected to expand into. And the yellow areas are also very important because those are areas with novel climates, so non-analog climates, where it's very difficult to try to project what's going to happen in those areas. And I'm just blowing up this part of the map here. So this is just a blow up of the Asian area, because what I want to show you is it was projected that this particular mosquito species would expand upward into the Himalayas. And in our report, we have enough new evidence that we were able to see that actually Nepal has 6 new vector-borne diseases that have emerged in the last 10 years due to climate change since the last report. And they involve 3 genera of mosquitoes, Anopheles, Culex, and Aedes, all that have expanded upward. And we've also seen increase in emergence of new diseases in the high Arctic. And these areas are very important for what we call our attribution of these changes to climate change, because in the high elevations of Nepal and in the high Arctic, very few other things are happening. They're relatively undisturbed, or the traditional management has relatively little changed. So these are not changes due to agricultural expansion or irrigation programs or changes in health programs. Many of the other things that affect whether humans get diseases, they actually are directly related to climate change in those regions. And in the high Arctic, some of those diseases are being caused by ticks, mosquitoes, biting midges, deer flies, horse flies, black flies, a whole suite of invertebrates that carry diseases. So this is really a new thing since the last report, is being able to relate these changes directly to climate change. Now, going to the pleasant insects that we sort of all know and love are pollinators. And it's actually quite a bit more difficult to try to look at changes in pollinators and relate them to climate change. But let's start about why we'd be interested. Well, globally, pollinators are actually essential for 20% of the species of fruits, nuts, and vegetables that humans grow. Climate change is expected to reduce the effectiveness of pollinators due to local loss of species. They simply get lost locally. And worry that, as we know that 2/3 of species are shifting their spring timing, and so it gives the possibility for flowers and their pollinators to get out of sync. Unfortunately, we don't have clear data as to whether that is happening yet, although it's projected to happen. But pollinators are declining due to all kinds of non-climate human activities, like pesticides, particularly neonicotinoids, loss of native breeding habitat. So where you've got crops and crops being pollinated by native insect species, often that isn't the breeding ground. The breeding ground is some native nearby habitat. And as those get lost, then you start losing that spillover of native pollinators into the cropland. And various increases in parasites, predators, and diseases, not all of which is understood, and not all clearly related to climate change. So it's been very difficult to assess this particular sector. But there's a very nice study that came out actually just recently. It's a 2020 study on bumblebees throughout North America and Europe. And what we see from this study is, and they were trying to focus on climate change. So I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name, Verrall et al. It's a difficult name to pronounce. So they looked at it in multiple different ways with very large long-term observational databases. And what they found, to start, is that when you look at the yearly variability and abundances of many of these bumblebees, you can get a quantitative estimate for their temperature tolerances just by looking at when they go up and when they go down. So they used that information from long-term observations to see, to characterize each species' thermal limits, and then to look at what's happened with the temperature in the areas where they live. And what these increasing reds show is that many species are now living closer to their temperature tolerances than they were 100 years ago. So this is primarily happening for these the high boreal regions where you'd expect it to happen. The most cold adapted species are up in the boreal regions. So you'd expect, as you get warming, those species would be getting closer to their hot temperature tolerances. But perhaps unexpectedly, you're also seeing this happening in Southern Europe, in parts of Spain and France. So they went on to look at what have the actual changes been in species richness. And as you know, I didn't repeat the fact. So half of species are moving poleward and upward, and I've given so many talks about that, I didn't want to repeat it. But as species are moving poleward and upward, you'd expect species richness to be increasing in colder areas and perhaps decreasing in warmer areas. That's an expectation. So if you look at the climate, the modeled change, this is this left-hand figure, what you'd expect to see based purely on climate change, how might species richness for this set of bumblebees, as I said, they've already characterized their climate space, where would you expect to see them decreasing versus increasing? And so it's not surprising that you expect perhaps decreases in the south, in Mexico, and in the southern part of Europe, and increases up in the Fennoscandia. And I'm not sure what the increases throughout the USA are quite related to. It may have been a precipitation effect, which is what I suspect. But you'd also expect these increases in the far north. So that's what you'd expect if only climate change were driving changes in species richness. On the right-hand side is the actual change in these areas. And you do see this increase in parts of Fennoscandia, but interestingly declines along the coastal areas, increases in Scotland, that's in real time. But interestingly, in the observed data set, you actually see declines through most of Europe and most of the USA, with some perhaps little patches where you're getting increases. And that is likely this combined effect of climate change, land use change, increased pesticides, and increased diseases. So this is partly to remind everyone that while this report is focused on climate change, we fully recognize that many, many other human activities are affecting our native biodiversity. And so when thinking of planning and what to do about it, we should incorporate all of these other activities as well. Butterflies are wonderful. They're, my favorite species, and I suspect many of yours also. And they're wonderful partly because, not that they're just beautiful, but they're also really fabulous climate change indicators, and we have really excellent data on them. It's very clear that climate change has already impacted butterflies' ecology, evolution, and extinction risk. But some of the new complex responses that we're seeing actually might help us with options for conservation that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of before. And this is my wonderful team in France helping me with butterfly work, including someone all of you know very well, Mike Singer, my husband. So with Euphydrus erytha, it's just been amazing to watch it in real time as it copes with climate change. So one of the key messages we have from Edith's checker spot is that populations are going extinct from climate extremes throughout the range. This is not just a range edge phenomena. And so simplistically thinking that, okay, you expect large impacts at warm range edges, but everywhere else will be fine, is absolutely not the case for Edith's checker spot, and I suspect not the case for many other species as well. We are seeing evolution in action, not for the first time with Edith's checker spot. So as temperatures are rising and the ground is getting too hot for the egg development, so I should back up perhaps and say that ground temperatures at these sites can reach 48 degrees centigrade. They're very, very hot. They're not covered with much vegetation. It's bare ground. And we're talking about at a 2,000 to 2,500 meters. So very intense solar radiation as well. And historically, the eggs were being laid at these low levels as an anti-predator behavior, because the predator, the deer, come and graze along the top. So if you lay your eggs very high, they're likely to get grazed. And we could see from taking them into the lab that the eggs were being laid at temperatures that were just below lethal. So 48 degrees is lethal. We were seeing ground temperatures at the place of egg laying almost to 48 degrees, often 46, 47 degrees. And what we've seen in real time over the past 10 years is the height of egg laying has gone up. presumably in selection against the warming temperature of the ground. But what we worry about, and we're going to be going out again this summer for hopefully another 2 or 3 month field season, is at what point do they get so high where they risk being grazed in sort of a normal grazing by the deer. So a third thing we've seen that's really exciting in Edith's checker spot is we've seen colonizations in real time. And whenever you get a colonization event, it appears to release genetic variation that was previously hidden. So you suddenly get a divergence of preferences for host plants, for example. And so this release of genetic variation has been found in other organisms as well, in many species of Drosophila. It may, at least for insects, it may end up being generalizable, that colonization events tend to release additive genetic variation. But this is a very new field. But what's exciting is that this may actually provide some options for evolution that we currently aren't even thinking of. So I have great hopes that Edith's checker spot will survive climate change. My one prediction for this talk. So insects have certainly been benefited from climate change, particularly forest insect pests, the moths and beetles specifically. In our report, we had enough evidence to say that not only have they expanded northward, but the severity and extent of outbreaks has increased due to warmer winters that reduce mortality, and also in these northern areas, these are typically boreal, northern temperate and boreal forest. In these areas where you've got enough precipitation, you also have longer growing seasons. That's allowing many more generations per year. Now, this was already underway in prior reports. For example, the mountain pine beetle had already been extending its range northwards into British Columbia. But what we've seen since the last report are really these massive outbreaks that have caused huge tree deaths and unfortunately huge releases of carbon. So here's the mountain pine beetle. It is considered an invasive species in the north, and it's described as small, dull, and cylindrical. But boy, its effect is anything but dull. This outbreak in British Columbia converted a huge amount of the forest to dead trees. So not only did you lose a lot of cubic meters of timber, but it caused a release. It caused this whole forest to change from being a carbon sink, to, removing more carbon than it put out, to being a carbon source across a huge area, 130,000 square kilometers. So it altered the carbon balance of this system, not just during the outbreak, but this release of emissions continued long after the outbreak. So where is the future leading us? Well, what I want to point out is we're at 1.09 degrees global warming. So 1.5 is not very far away. And yet that still is giving an even further increase in warming, especially in these high northern latitude systems. 2 degrees, again, that small increase from 1.5 to 2 is really ramping up warming, especially in these northern latitudes. And then at 4 degrees, really the whole globe has warmed quite a bit, as much as 5 degrees. This has an impact on precipitation as well. Precipitation has more uncertainty about it, but we can still say that at 1.5, we're already seeing changes, areas that are increasing in precipitation, particularly in the northern latitudes, declines throughout much of the tropical and lower temperate latitudes, with parts of Africa being an exception to that. And as we see going up to 4 degrees, that just keeps strengthening. Now, since this talk is I'm virtually giving this talk in London, I want to point out that it looks as though Britain isn't having that big a change in precipitation. Even at 4 degrees, it looks like that drying trend is maybe just getting into southern England, but not very much. But that's misleading, because what I think is more important are the estimates for what's happening with soil moisture, because plants live, their roots are in the ground. What really matters to them is what's happening in the soil. And at that, you see much, to me, more dramatic drying. So now you're seeing drying throughout the Midwest USA, which is the flyway, migration flyway for many species of birds. And in the Midwest, in here, which is our corn belt, that's our breadbasket. You're also seeing extreme drying throughout the Mediterranean, even at 1.5. And again, while this gets worse with warming, it's already, even though Britain in an absolute sense is not projected to have much less rainfall, when you look at soil moisture, the increased temperatures are going to be driving an increased drying of pretty much the whole of the UK. And one reason this is such a worry for me personally is that the peatlands, there's an enormous amount of peatlands in the UK, much of it in boggy areas, waterlogged areas. Peatlands encompass about 12% of the UK. They store 3.2 billion tons of carbon. And that's more carbon than all the forest in the UK, Germany, and France combined. So here's this huge, brilliant carbon storage plant, but damaging the peatlands is causing release of carbon emissions as it decomposes. And right now, that amounts to about 13% of the UK emissions. And I had to put in a picture of Dartmoor, where I've enjoyed many, many happy years walking through undamaged peatland. And the peatlands have a fabulous insect biodiversity. Many species of butterfly and dragonfly are specialists on the plants that grow in the wet bogs. It also contains some insects that are more common that perhaps humans are not as concerned about, but this drying of the peat bogs is reducing the numbers of crane flies, and these actually turn out to be an important food source for many of the peatland birds. So everything interacts. Even species that you may not personally care about may be important for some of the species that you do care about. We're also seeing a large change in fire risk in the last century. This is a projection for the next 100 years. It's from the last IPCC report, because the current one just didn't have it depicted as a map, and I really liked being able to show it as a map. So all the red areas have an increase in fire risk, so an increase in fire weather. And Working Group 1 that just came out in August said, yes, fire weather has already increased, not just projected to, but it's already increased. Fire seasons have lengthened. These are projected to continue, particularly in Arctic and boreal systems, Mediterranean type ecosystems, so the Mediterranean proper, but also South Africa, California, other systems that have a Mediterranean climate. It is expected to be worse in degraded tropical forest and the forest savanna ecotones in the tropics. And what we've just come out with is the actual observed impacts, which is the burn itself, and concluded that climate change has caused increases in area burned. And this is particularly clear in the Western USA, where we've got very good attribution to human-driven climate change, and burned area has doubled. In other parts of the world, burns have increased. In Australia, for example, but we don't yet have the studies that have been able to directly link that to climate change. But since fire weather has increased in those areas and a burned area has increased, I personally think that's just a matter of the studies coming out in the next few years. We'll be able to make that link much more positively. So all of these processes that I've been talking about are already happening. And there's a term called overshoot, which is increasingly being heard in the different meetings of international governments who are trying to decide not only on targets, but on emission reductions targets. And so in Glasgow at COP26, many governments were saying, okay, it's from working group 1, we can see that it's going to be very difficult to stay below 1.5 or even 2 degrees. So maybe we need to start preparing for overshoot. And overshoot means that global warming goes over that target for a few decades, and then you get new technologies. Fusion power suddenly becomes possible on a large scale. You get new technologies that will efficiently suck up, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Right now, that technology exists, but it's in the laboratory. It's not scaled up to anything like what you would need to make a dent in the global atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So the idea is we get that technology going, okay, it'll take 50 or 100 years, but then we can get global warming down to a lower level. So what Working Group 2 did is we put together a set of risks from overshoot. So what impacts are irreversible and what impacts are become harder and harder to reverse the longer you're in an overshoot situation. So in terms of irreversible impacts, I think a really obvious one to a lot of people is species extinctions. If a species goes extinct, you're not going to get it back. Jurassic Park is a wonderful idea, but it's a Hollywood idea. That's not going to happen in real life. So looking at species extinctions, we've already seen for sure 2 species gone extinct due to climate change, where we can directly relate those extinctions to climate change. Another 90 species that are from what we now see as very strong interaction between a disease and climate change, specifically it's chytrid fungus. So we've already had some 92 species go extinct due to climate change. Hundreds of populations have gone extinct due to, in particular, heat extremes, and this has happened in trees, in mammals, and in insects. So we're already seeing massive local losses and the first species extinctions. And this graph is showing you projections into the future with 1.5, 2 degrees, et cetera, warming. And what you see, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of these numbers before, but now we've got, more than 178 studies, more than 135,000 species. So we're just building up that database, that evidence base. And you can see that, especially if you look at what's happening at the maximum, the likely range means that there's more than a 67% chance that this is true. And what you see is really a ramping up of these maximums with every little increment of global warming. What's happening at the reason the lower level is not changing very much, we think we couldn't assess it because we didn't have the manpower. It would need, probably a 4-year postdoc. But we think what's happening is the newer studies, these big 30,000, 40,000, 100 and some thousand species, are including a lot of common species. And those very common, very widespread generalist species are not expected to be heavily impacted by climate change. But up here, the rarest species, the endemics, the ones that are already at the limits of their climate tolerance, the mountaintop, the high Arctic, those are the ones that are probably bringing up this extinction risk so much. Another way of looking at it is looking at local losses. So this is a different data. It's not a different database. It's a different way of looking at the database where you're really focusing on what's happening in a particular location, how many species are projected to be lost in that location. And what's alarming is even at 1.5, many areas are expected to lose a quarter of their species locally. Again, these are not, the species may exist elsewhere, but it doesn't exist locally. And some areas, even at 1.5, are losing up to 50% of their species. And so as warming continues, you get this more areas that are now losing more than 75% of their species. And what we put together is the evidence that as you lose species, those ecosystems that they're in start, you're damaging the ecosystem integrity. You're reducing that ecosystem's ability to function, and you're reducing its resilience to future climate change, and therefore its ability to provide services for people, like water provisioning, like pollinators, like wood products, food, etc. So these local losses, you don't have to have a species go extinct globally to feel the impacts of those local extinctions on the ability of the nearby human settlements to get the provisioning that they historically have been able to get from those natural systems. So if you think about all the things that I've been pulling together, climate change, the main message is that we are now seeing ecological processes that are being put into place that are increasing emissions from the biosphere into the atmosphere. And these include the increased forest insect outbreaks, the increased wildfire, the mass mortality of trees from drought, which is happening, by the way, in every system, tropical, temperate, and boreal forest, the drying of peatlands, the thawing of permafrost. And so what we're seeing is these systems now are still kind of bouncing back and forth, but at some point they will tip over and become permanent sources. The difficulty for us is that we don't know exactly when that tipping point occurs. But what we do know, and what we did in the report, is as warming continues, it gets harder and harder to reverse these processes. And the bottom line message is that humans can control our own emissions, but we cannot control the emissions from the biosphere. So it's a real warning about the risks from these overshoot pathways that many policymakers are now starting to think, well, that's the way we're going to go because we can't possibly stay under the 1.5 or even the 2-degree targets that we did agree on back in the Paris Accords in 2015. I don't want to be totally depressing because we do still have options. We have a small window and it's narrowing fast, but they are still there. And the bottom line is that nature is still the absolute best way to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Technology is not there yet. It may be there in 50 to 100 years, but it is not right now. So we must get our natural ecosystems. We must protect what's already intact. We must restore the ecosystems that are degraded and damaged to get them back into health so they can be maximal carbon sinks. But we also need to develop. So we need to develop in ways that incorporate the natural system more into the landscape, more into our planning. Rather than thinking that we're competing, we have to think in terms of recognizing that dependency and recognizing that development must move forward in a way that's beneficial to nature. So here's just some options. You can go fully towards many renewable energies while also mixing them with growing food, either growing crops or growing livestock. There's no reason to think that it's an either or situation. And if you look at the sheep on the right, you'll notice there's actually quite a good floral diversity. So you can keep your insects and your birds and many of the other biodiversity going. There are agroecological farming practices that involve planting diversities of crops, planting them more within smaller plots, more embedded within a natural landscape. This is beneficial in terms of climate resilience of the crops because of the different crops have slightly different climate tolerances. So in what is a bad year climatically for one crop may not be for the other. So you don't lose your whole food production with climate variability increasing. You tend to maintain a more stable level of food production with more mixed crops by having more natural areas and more native species embedded within it. You keep those native predators, so that will keep the pests down and reducing our need for pesticide and helping the whole system be healthier. People think of ecological farming as kind of a tropical thing like the photo I just showed, but I want to point out that Europe can have agroecological farming and does have it as well. So on the right is an Austrian vineyard where you can see it's very much embedded within a landscape of native trees. And in the UK, of course, the hedgerows. What I was incredibly impressed by when I moved to the UK is how much native biodiversity you can retain with a relatively small area, natural area, as long as you keep them connected. And the hedgerows are the perfect example of that. They not only connect larger natural areas so that things can move through from one large protected landscape to another protected area, but they themselves can house many insects and birds and floral diversity. And we need to transform our cities. By 2050, urban areas could be home to more than 2/3 of the world's population. So greening up our cities is incredibly important, both to help cool. I mean, literally, you can shade the ground, but the evapotranspirative properties of plants will help locally cool the cities. Right now, you have a very strong urban warming effect, which is above and beyond what the general global warming is doing. And so by greening up cities, you can literally help to locally cool them. And of course, if you do it the right way, with some nice native plants, you can actually help native biodiversity. And I'm showing this because you can be planting flowers as well as planting trees and other greenery, and you can help native insects through building structures for them to breed in. So this right here in the middle is a bee hotel right in the center of Paris, in the big botanic garden, literally right in the center of Paris. And it was fabulous. When you looked around it, you could see, I think within 15 minutes, I saw a dozen different species of bees. Really incredible. It doesn't have to be this elaborate. You can just put a little one, outside your own garden, make sure you've got some flowers around, but anything helps. But we've got to be very careful of some of these mitigation strategies. So, planting trees is great if you do it in the right place in the right way. An area that was naturally forested, sure, you can replant the forest. But it's absolutely wrong thing to think that you should plant trees everywhere. It doesn't take into account that many of these areas are naturally grasslands or naturally peatlands. Not only do they support very high biodiversity, but often when you try to plant trees in an area where they don't naturally occur, you create an unstable forest that's not climate resilient, that can often die with the next extreme climate year. Then you have a bunch of dead trees who start decomposing. You get a fire, releasing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. There was a disaster in northern England in the 1980s when someone tried to drain a peatland and plant trees, and immediately you got outgassing of enormous amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So tree planting can be the right thing to do, but it is not always the right thing to do. And I do want to remind you, grasslands are crucial for biodiversity and for livelihoods. This is where I currently live, in the Ariège in the Pyrenees. It would all be forest if you let it go. But at this point, you have a whole slew of birds and butterflies and other insects that are adapted to these grasslands. And they're necessary for food production. So this is a working cattle farm, has fabulous biodiversity. Those can go hand in hand if you do it right. If you don't overgraze, you have a low level. And I guess my take-home message is we do have a window of opportunity to limit global warming, but it's small and it is rapidly shrinking. We do still have options, but we need to recognize that humans depend upon nature to achieve climate resilient development. And the numbers that we put together, it's variable, depends on where you are, what system you're in, but something like globally 30 to 50% of the land needs to be protected in order to achieve climate resilient development. And in addition to that, human development needs to be accepting that it should be more of a cohabitation with nature rather than a competition with nature. And I hope I haven't left with too depressing a message, but I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camille. That was a fascinating overview and spanning many different topics. And just when we think about that huge number of papers that have been synthesized, it's incredible that you've managed to convey so much of that to us through this Verrall lecture. So thank you so much for that. And
you're very welcome. And I guess I will stop sharing now, right?
Oh, yeah, that would be perfect, actually. That's a good point. Yeah, thank you, Camille. So we do have a lot of questions that are coming in, but I just wanted to ask, on the point that you said at the end around this depressing, and these are stark messages. They're stark messages that are coming out from the IPCC, and we're seeing stark messages from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services as well. And I wondered what your one message of hope would be for us all.
My one message of hope, boy, that's putting me on the spot. Well, the message of hope is that if you put the numbers together, we actually can limit global warming. We can do it. I mean, and we lay out all the different options. And Working Group 3 in a month is going to lay out all these different mitigation options. So, the scientific evidence is that it is still possible. But it really does require a shift in how people think about how they live. People in cities often, they have a mindset that nature is something you visit on the weekend to take a walk, but it's got nothing to do with them. And all the evidence we put together in the report is that that is simply not true. Where you have degraded the ecosystem outside the city, you're having serious problems with water provisioning. You're having serious food shortages. Right? So we're hoping that a key message people get is humans do depend upon nature. And therefore, even if you're not a conservation biologist, even if you don't care about, the dragonflies and the butterflies and the birds, you must support actions that will incorporate protection and conservation into long-term urban planning.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. Thank you, Camille. And I think that those interactions amongst these different drives of change, it's really important that we understand them better. And it's great to see the IPCC and IPBES working together with joint reports highlighting that role that the nature can. Thank you very much for that, Camille. We have lots of different questions coming through, so I'm going to try and get through as many of them as possible. I also want to say that we're getting a huge amount of positive praise and comments for you within the chat. So I hope you see those, but we will save the chat and send it over to you so that you can see.
Oh, thank you.
Without that real round of applause, but there has been a round of applause within the chats. The first question that we're going to actually, though, is for Richard Harrington. And given that Richard Harrington is a panelist here, he can ask it himself. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Camille, so much. That was a fabulously informative talk, and we've been so lucky with the timing of the Verrall in relation to the publication of the IPCC report. You may disagree with that, you must be exhausted, but thank you so much for that talk. What I wanted to ask, when you see stories in the papers about insects and climate change, it's usually an increase in something we don't want, like, you know, the pest insects, or it's a decrease in beneficial insects or rare insects or iconic insects. And I've often hypothesized that this is because the traits that make insects pests, such as high fecundity and high mobility, also make them very adaptable to changes in the climate. So we tend, under a change scenario, we tend to get more of what we don't want and less of what we do want, because they have the opposite traits. Have you seen in your review any evidence for this hypothesis that I've always held to but never really tested?
I would love to say yes, but I cannot. I'll admit, this has been a puzzle to me personally as well. Why is it that all the big increases are these noxious pests, and a lot of the declines are the rare, endemic, highly sensitive species? And so I would say that's ripe for much more detailed physiological studies. The physiological ecology literature on this was really weak. So I think this is one avenue, is getting the hardcore physiologist and the hardcore ecologist together working on these issues, because I agree with you. It is clearly a pattern we're seeing, and it is a bit puzzling. I mean, when you think of very small range endemic species, it's kind of, I think it is expected that those are going to be the hardest hit, and that's what we're seeing, right? But there are other species that aren't that rare, and yet we're still seeing overall declines. I mean, the bumblebee paper was interesting in that in areas even where some species were doing better, right? You got an increase in abundance because the climate was going into their climate window. There were more species showing decline, so that overall community shift tended to be lower species richness. And, why should that be? Is it just a lag time, or is it really that the climate change we're seeing, is it really taking too many species out of their tolerance range? And why isn't it doing that for a lot of the pest species?
Thank you. So a traits-based approach is, in the future, is an area that's worth major consideration. So, yeah. Thank you so much. I will disappear back into the background.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Camille. We have quite a number of questions, and I'd really love to get through as many as possible in the next 10 minutes. So I'll try and cluster a few of them as well for you, Camille. But the first one is from Christopher Williams, asking, are there any cases where pollinators could benefit from climate change? But Christopher also asks about interactions amongst different drivers. So he would like to know about pollinators benefiting from climate change, but also about the other interactions with things like global change and climate change, invasive species and things like that.
Well, as we've seen, there are some species basically, whether a species benefits or not, it partly depends where you are in that species range. So some populations are doing better, some populations are doing worse. And we're seeing that really across all the different species that we've looked at. It's a mosaic. And so in some areas, certainly some species are doing better because of climate change. It's gotten a bit warmer, it's gotten perhaps a bit wetter or a bit drier, and put those populations into a climate space where they can do well. But the real key as a conservation biologist is that in general, land use change trumps climate change. And so that's, to me, the real conservation issue, is that if it were if Earth were uninhabited by humans, I think we'd be seeing a lot more community shifts, community change, but not necessarily at a global level, you know, all these negative messages that we're coming out with now. But these large urban areas, large agricultural areas, roads not allowing the natural movement of species is effectively making a lot of them small range endemics, even if they're not, if you see what I mean. It's confining them so they can't express themselves in ways that perhaps would be best with climate change. So that is the problem, is it's the interaction between the two that makes it very difficult for wild species to cope.
Thank you very much for that. And we'll stay with pollinators and bumblebees for the moment, in that Tracy Burge has asked, regarding the bumblebee richness slide, they're very surprised about the temporal and spatial range of the long-term data. Where are the data sets coming from that span from the 1900s?
I didn't do that study, so I'm afraid you'd have to look at where those long-term databases are from. But it was, I mean, it's a solid study. It's, you know, it is just solid long-term observations. It's not extrapolating or backcasting from climate models where those species should have been. And that does happen in other literature, but the one reason that we used that paper is actually it was straightforward long-term observational data. And, you know, Britain has amazing databases, but generally it's very difficult for other regions to have those kind of databases. So I was just thrilled that some areas actually had it for bumblebees.
Yeah, and it gives us a good excuse to celebrate those long-term, large-scale data sets that have been contributed by volunteers from around the world. I mean, they are absolutely incredible. And I think you highlighted, you know, there are, of course, data gaps, and we need to get even more data, but it's fantastic that we do have those data sets. But yeah, we'll have to go in a little bit more detail to that bumblebee study and find exactly those data sets. But you can take a look on the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. That might be a good starting point for some of those data sets. So thank you for that. I'm going to skip to Peter Merritt's talking about the spread of fall armyworm into sub-Saharan Africa, and could that be related to climate change? Peter Merritt asks.
Oh boy, yeah, that's. I'm just going to be honest. I know what he's talking about, and I remember the discussions about it, and I think we felt it wasn't solid enough to include that in our report. And unfortunately, that's true of a lot of the literature. It may be a wonderful data set, but if a lot of other human activities are going on and it becomes very confounded with climate change, then we tended to not include that in the report, because we're really trying to focus on the impacts of climate change. And so to do that, you really need databases where either they're in relatively undisturbed areas or that particular species is relatively unaffected by the kind of land use changes that are going on in the area where the data is being gathered. And it gets very difficult. And I'll be honest, probably the best data sets have already been used. At this point, new data sets coming out tend to be very confounded, simply because, you know, we kind of targeted the best ones 10 years ago. So unfortunately, for a lot of these pest outbreaks, it's very difficult to tease apart the separate effects of climate change from the effects of, say, crop management, irrigation changes, human settlement changes, et cetera. And if I'm thinking back, I think that was one case where we were not able to do it.
Thank you, Camille. So I'm going to move to a question from Stuart Reynolds, who asks, what would it mean for an ecosystem to lose more than 75% of its biodiversity? And are there examples of this extent of biodiversity loss that have already happened? And what would happen to the primary productivity, for example? So 3 questions in one, and 4 very big questions.
Yeah, well, fortunately, there have been a lot of recent studies looking at this, both experimentally, just, setting up, and this is often done with plants, setting up plots with different species richness and looking at their productivity and their resilience to climate shocks, et cetera. But also we've got some long-term data sets where you simply can see losses of species in certain areas, and you've got the numbers on what impact did that have on pollination provisioning. And what we see is losses even on the order of 10 to 20%. You do get a significant negative drop in whatever the service is, that metric that's being looked at. Sometimes it's net primary productivity, sometimes it's pollinator richness, sometimes it's water provisioning. So it doesn't take a 75% loss. 10 to 20% losses are detectable in drops in services. And, I don't know specifically of studies that have looked at higher losses, but I would assume if you're getting significant drops in services with 10 to 20%, that if you go up to 75%, that it's really getting into the realm of ecosystem collapse. And you're actually, I should take that back. You are seeing that in tropical coral reefs, where you are losing, 75% of the species, and you are getting collapse of those ecosystems. They're not able to maintain the function that they have historically had in the ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Camille. So we have a question here from Robert Calvert, which sort of relates to this, that when we're thinking of, we talk about biodiversity a lot, but often we're thinking about biodiversity change. And Robert asks, when examining percentage of local biodiversity loss, does this also factor in migration of new species from heat-tolerant environments?
Yeah, so you'd expect that, right? And we're seeing that to some extent. So, southern Sweden, southern Finland are getting an increase in, say, butterfly diversity, and it's a real increase. But interestingly, you don't really see that in the big global databases. And I personally think what's going on is it is land use change coming in and preventing a lot of that dispersal that you might be expecting. Southern Canada is getting an increase in butterfly richness. So yes, we're seeing it, but not to the extent that I would have expected. And as I said, I suspect it's just barriers to dispersal coming in, the big agricultural fields, the big urban areas. For amphibians, just road, it doesn't even have to be a very big area, just anything that's a barrier to dispersal. So I would have expected to be seeing more areas with increasing species richness than we are seeing in the observed database. And we don't have an analysis that points to, we're not seeing it because of land use change. So it's very difficult to do those analyses. I know Lenoir et al. Put together a database of some 12,000 species, looking at distribution changes in 12,000 species, and concluded that in that data, and it was not a climate change attribution, it was just, here's all the data, here's what's happening across the world with these 12,000 species. And they saw much less poleward and upward movement than you'd expect from the local or regional climate change. And their conclusion was they suspected land use change was preventing the dispersal of species. So we have some hints. We can't say that for sure, but we certainly have some studies that are where you can infer that that's what's going on.
Great, thank you very much, Camille. There are many more questions that have been appearing, but you have addressed some of them in your answers to do with other aspects to do with elevation change, and people are asking about exploring in a little bit more detail some of the points. And just to highlight that the lecture has been recorded and will be available for you to watch again, so you'll be able to go through and take some more notes a long way. So I'm going to go to one last question for Camille, and there's a few questions that have come through in this general theme around organic farming and ecological farming and how this can really help to minimize global warming.
So what's the question?
The question is, my question is, how can organic farming, ecological farming can help to minimize
Oh, you
global
mean,
warming? But there is another one on land sparing and land sharing. So I think anything just standing on that point around the agroecology aspects that you mentioned and the ways in which we can use the land more wisely to both benefit nature but also to ensure food production. I think there's a few questions in that area.
okay, so agroecological farming, I think what you mean is, why is it good? So yeah, I didn't really talk about, I sort of presumed everyone knew it was good. So it turns out, one, you know, these approaches use much less pesticide and artificial fertilizer. So artificial fertilizer is actually a major source of greenhouse gases. So you put, and it's partly the way farmers do it, they tend to put too much on, they put it on way too early when the plants can't take it up. And so you're putting nitrogen on the ground before the plants are big enough to really absorb it. And I can't remember the percentage, it's some huge percentage, something like 40 to 60% of the nitrogen that's put on croplands as fertilizer actually ends up either gassing out into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, or being washed off into the streams and rivers and causing eutrophication. So it's partly it's changing how you apply it and how much you apply, but certainly using organic fertilizer, you know, horse manure, cow manure, you don't get those massive releases like you do with the inorganic fertilizers. So that's one thing. Being agroecological farming tends to use organic fertilizers, less fertilizers. They use either biopesticide, you know, biological control, or very little pesticide, so that you don't have as big an impact. You know, you're trying to embed crops in a natural landscape. So you don't want to be using a lot of artificial pesticides. You want to be encouraging the natural predators of your crop pest and using biocontrolled methods, but also encouraging the natural predators coming in from the native bits of land that you've left around. So that's good for biodiversity, and it's good for humans because we don't want to be eating a lot of pesticide. So the third thing is this diversification of the crops, planting many crops and kind of interspersed with some native species. And that's really important for climate resilience. To keep your food production climate resilient, you don't want to have these huge monoculture landscapes of a single crop that can be devastated with a single bad year. Now, one thing, so productivity is more stable when you move to agroecological farming methods. And there's evidence that those systems do store more carbon because they tend to have more native plants interspersed. The soil's in better shape, it's in better health. That's not a huge effect, but you know, every little bit helps. And finally, what are the negatives? And I was actually just talking with one of the authors who was most heavily involved in the agroecological farming assessment. And I said, well, you know, all of this sounds great, but one of the advantages of big industrial agriculture is you buy these huge combines and you can just harvest it all at once. If you've got a bunch of mixed crops, diverse in a small landscape, it seemed to me you'd have to move more to manual labor for harvesting. And the response I got is that there isn't literature on that. And so again, this is something where we need new studies to explicitly look at what are the positive and negatives of agroecological farming versus sort of big industrial farming. We already know a lot of the positives, but in order to convince many parts of the world to shift to that, we also need to say, well, is it more costly? Is it more labor intensive? And the numbers, the literature just isn't there, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Camille, for your very full and thorough answers to all the many and diverse questions that have come through from the audience. We've really appreciated the discussion that has taken place, and we can see that through the chat as well. So thank you again. And I just wanted to mention to everyone that you will be giving a lecture on Saturday, the young Verrall, And so if you know of young people who might like to join, and or you may wish to join again, the Young Verrall will be on Saturday afternoon. You can find more information about registering for that on the Royal Entomological Society website. And we're very, very grateful to you, Camille, for agreeing to do that. But huge thanks for this wonderful lecture. It's now my great pleasure to hand to you the President's Medal, and through some kind of trickery, we will manage it between us, despite the fact that we're not stood next to one another. So thank you very much, Camille, and congratulations on a fantastic lecture.
Thank you. And there it is.
There it is.
Imagine that. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who has attended. It's really been wonderful to have you all with us. I wish we could see you all there in the audience and be able to share a cup of tea now. But we look forward to seeing you next year, and we very much hope that you will join the Society if you're not already a member or a fellow. And thank you very much again. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.